some of the key insights from the 2014 World Giving Index, which, as Laura said, was published in November last year. We want to expand on some of the reasons for some of the results seen, and then move on to highlight how the study has already helped to stimulate discussion and further exploration about trends in the marketplace. So just some background to the World Giving Index. As Laura already mentioned, the World Giving Index is the only global study of generosity. It's based on data from Gallup's Worldview World Poll, which is an extensive study that covers many, many different topics, and it's conducted across over 140 countries each year. Our 2014 report focuses primarily on the data from the 2013 interviews, but it does also show an over time average and trend line for the 5 years that the index has been produced by Charities Aid Foundation. So in some instances you'll see the trend from 2009 to 2013, which provides a great historical track. The study is robust and representative. The 3 giving measures that we asked in 2013 were asked of over 130,000 individuals across 135 countries. In most countries, 1,000 interviews are undertaken, although in some smaller markets it's reduced to 500, and in larger markets such as China and Russia, it's actually increased to 2,000 interviews. Now, it's important to make the distinction that it doesn't ask about the amount of money donated or the amount of time given. It just asks for 3 measures in terms of participation. So it asks whether you donated money to a charity, whether you volunteered your time to an organisation, or whether you helped a stranger in the months prior to interview. The inclusion of those 3 different ways of giving really allows for a more even playing field on which to make worldwide comparisons, so rather than merely reflecting a country's wealth. Despite this, obviously, the study cannot capture every single nuance of charitable behaviour given the breadth of countries and cultures included. But at an individual country level, the World Giving Index is sometimes the only measure available by which to track charitable behaviours over time, and so it can be incredibly important for many of the markets that are included. Just looking at some of the top-line findings from the World Giving Index, if we look first of all at the graph on the right-hand side, here you can see what I was saying about the trend from 2009 to 2013 and how we can look at the trends in giving across the whole of the World Giving Index against things like the growth in GDP across the world. So what we see for our 2013 surveys is that the average percentage of those helping a stranger or volunteering time increased globally from 2012, whilst the proportion donating money has actually declined marginally. Now, it's only 0.6 percentage points, but it is of interest as all 3 measures have previously moved in unison, so they've all gone up together or they've all gone down together. This is the only time we've seen where one of them has moved at contrast to the other 2. And the decline seems to be reflecting a continuing slowdown in GDP growth in 2013, which again was down again as we see the slowdown in growth continuing. When we looked further and dig deeper into the data, it shows that actually giving amongst those aged 15 to 29 has experienced the biggest decline. So those giving money in that age group is now at just over 21% compared to 30% amongst those that are aged 50 and over. So it's possible that it's a reflection of growing global unemployment amongst the young. So between 15 and 24-year-olds, global unemployment is currently running at 13% compared to an overall average of 6%. So this group of individuals, if they're unemployed, they may have reduced disposable income and so can't contribute financially in the ways that they have done in the past. It's also possible that it could be a reflection in a change in attitudes with participation in giving taking other forms, such as the growth in youth activism that we have seen in some markets, and that is actually taking the place of giving money. Despite a fall in the proportion of people giving money, actual population growth around the world means that in absolute numbers of people, around 86 million more people gave money worldwide. And we can see on the left-hand side there the total numbers of people that have given, helped a stranger, donated money or volunteered time in 2013. This shows the World Giving Index distribution across the globe. The top 10% of the most generous nations are in the red and the orange, and the lowest 10% are in the dark blue. Top of this year, actually jointly, is the United States and Myanmar, both with the World Giving Index rating of 64% overall. That's an average score across the three giving measures, and that's what gives us our overall index when we place people in order of that rating. We'll come on to discuss why the USA and Myanmar are top of the scale in a moment. The rest of the top 10 remains much as it was in the 2013 report, so for 2012. It features Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, the United Kingdom, Sri Lanka, Trinidad and Tobago. Malaysia is a notable entrant to the top 10. It was actually placed 71st in the 2013 report, to now be ranked 7th in the 2014 report. Again, we'll go on to discuss the potential reasons why that might be in a moment. At the bottom of the World Giving Index for 2014 is Yemen, with an overall score of just 14%, and it's followed by Venezuela, Palestinian territory, Ecuador and Montenegro. However, whilst we might look at the overall index, it's important to recognise that different behaviours are stronger in different cultures and markets. So, for example, helping a stranger is particularly strong in the USA, Iraq, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica and Liberia. Donating money is very strong in Myanmar, Malta, Thailand, Ireland and the UK. And volunteering is very strong in Turkmenistan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka and Uzbekistan. And what we need to remember is that informal giving behaviours such as helping a stranger can often be the foundation for the development of other social activities and a strong civil society generally. Now, I mentioned earlier that we know differences exist by culture in individual countries. It is important that these are acknowledged in any reading of the index. We can't just take it as a straight index. We do have to try and interpret the results. So if we look at the position of Myanmar as joint first in 2014, this is driven primarily by a very high proportion of people donating money. 9 out of 10 have done so in the previous month prior to interview, and that equates to 36 million individuals. Now, the reason for this is the strong Theravada Buddhist community within Myanmar. They have an estimated 500,000 monks receiving support from lay devotees, and the act of giving or dana is integral to religious observance among Theravada Buddhists, with it being one of the key paths to earning good merit. As we can see, there's another country with a high proportion of Theravada Buddhists, Thailand, and that's ranked 3rd for donating money on 77%. So that's one of the reasons why Myanmar is actually joint first overall in the index, because it performs so outstandingly in terms of donating money. Its joint first position with the United States of America, that's actually the United States is performing in the top 10 for all 3 ways of giving, and it's the only country in the index to feature in the top 10 for all 3, and that's why it earns its first place in the index. Another example of the influence of a specific culture is in the volunteering ranking, where we see a number number of former Soviet states, so Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they all performed strongly. These former Soviet states share a culture of subotnik, which is giving up, or traditionally was the giving up of a Saturday to volunteer or perform unpaid labour. In some instances, mandatory subotniks have been introduced to fill a gap in services, and so it's possible that some instances are inflating volunteering levels recorded in these countries. Now, rather than attempt to correct the World Giving Index data for any such behaviours, we believe it's more valuable to actually present the index as it is, with all of these anomalies and differences. We think that they are interesting in themselves and that they provide insight into the specific cultures of individual countries and do provide points for further discussion and exploration. As mentioned earlier, the inclusion of volunteering and helping a stranger within the World Giving Index really means that it isn't just a reflection of the respective wealth of the country. And as we can see, only 5 of the countries in this year's World Giving Index Top 20 are also members of the G20. In fact, 11 G20 countries are ranked outside of our top 50, and 3 of these are even outside the top 100, so that's Russia, China and Turkey. If we look at the countries within the World Giving Index analysed by UN economic classifications, which is shown here on the right-hand side in terms of developed, in transition or developing economies, we can see that actually the performance amongst developed countries between 2012 and 2013 was static or down on all 3 measures, whilst transitioning and developing economy markets have experienced growth in at least 2 of the 3 charitable behaviours. So clearly a prosperous economy doesn't guarantee higher levels of giving money. Rather, an uplift in giving is often dependent on a country taking some positive action to encourage this behaviour. Looking over a longer time period, analysis shows that 15 countries have seen their current year score, so their 2013 score, rise 5 percentage points or more above their 5-year average. So what this suggests is a continually improving picture. And of these 15 countries, 14 are defined as transitioning or developing economies by the UN. And in one area that they're particularly improving is in the help of a stranger behaviour, clearly showing the capacity for growth in the charitable sector in these transitioning and developing economies. One of the other findings and areas that the World Giving Index can highlight is jumps in performance. And I mentioned earlier how Malaysia had jumped from being ranked 71st in the 2013 report to now being 7th in our 2014 report. That results from a 26 percentage point increase year on year, and this was a wide-ranging behavioural change which saw an uplift across all 3 of the giving measures and across all demographic groups. Looking closely at the data, we established that Malaysia was actually surveyed following Typhoon Haiyan, which impacted the neighbouring Philippine archipelago on November the 8th, 2013. And so that uplift is likely to reflect the humanitarian effort undertaken on behalf of its neighbour during this time. And this effect has actually been seen before in the World Giving Index data, with uplifts following natural disasters in China in 2010 and in Japan in 2011. What we need to understand is whether and how these changes are maintained in the longer term, and that's questionable. Participation in giving in these behaviours often returns to pre-disaster levels in subsequent years. It may be that countries need to improve their ability to harness such emergency or disaster generosity for the longer term benefit of their people. And part of this is ensuring that the necessary infrastructures are in place to encourage individual giving and the broader development of civil society within a country. So that was a quick run through some of the key findings from the World Giving Index in 2014. Obviously, the full report is available, and we have a link to that at the end of the presentation. I think the point that I wanted to make is that the World Giving Index is not intended to be an academic exercise. It's not just the survey. A big part of it is getting people to talk about these issues in order to change things for the better. You know, we need to think, what other study reaches up to 500 million people and gets over 24 countries talking about giving? It generates discussion through our Future World Giving project, which focuses on how to unlock the potential of global philanthropy. It's actually changed behaviour in individual countries. Following the very first World Giving Index, the Malaysian Prime Minister cited the country's low volunteering score as contributing to their decision to establish a new pan-Malaysian volunteering body. A number of individual country studies have been conducted in order to explore and explain the findings from the World Giving Index in greater detail. For example, CAC's own Russia Giving or India Giving study. And the raw data can be used to combine with other data sets to try and further enlighten people about civil society and philanthropy around the world. It does provide a data foundation for additional and further exploration. Now, Adam Pickering, who is our International Policy Manager within the Giving Thought Programme, and he's the lead on the Future World Giving project, is now going to take you through some examples of how the World Giving Index has been applied in these ways.
Thanks, Debbie. So as Debbie alluded to, the World Giving Index has been kind of providing questions for us to answer for several years now. The idea behind the Future World Giving project was partly to try and build on the World Giving Index data and sort of pool some of those questions together and try and answer them in a useful way and continue to use our research to try and influence around the world. When we were thinking about all those questions, really they all boil down to one huge question, which is, I think, significant for everyone on this conference, which is, why do some countries see higher rates of giving than others? Now, we may have assumptions about exactly why that might be. It might be to do with the economic situation of a country or religious elements in society. It may be what we define sort of in the nebulous term of culture, but we wondered whether there was something specific, something hard that we could get to, and whether we might be able to make recommendations. So that's really the kind of story behind the Future World Giving project, which looks at how we can kind of motivate a sort of a global culture of giving, and what policies might specifically help us to implement that around the world. So this should all be seen in the context of a unique opportunity that we face at the moment. We're seeing around the world an explosion in the growth of middle classes. In the next generation, by 2030, in fact, the OECD projects that the number of middle-class people in the world will grow by 165%. Now, this is a kind of one-off opportunity to engage people in a relationship with their newfound income, newfound discretionary income, whereby they also see at the same time the opportunity to engage in philanthropy. And if we don't start that conversation about philanthropy at the same time as people have their first experience of wealth, we may be missing this huge opportunity. So let's put this in a little bit of context. By 2030, the OECD estimates that middle-class people around the world will have an income approaching $55 trillion. Now, if those people were to give about 1% of their income to charitable causes, that would amount to over $500 billion. Now, obviously, that's an optimistic figure, that 1% figure, but we should bear in mind that that is less than the proportion of income given by households in the United States, significantly less. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be as optimistic for future generations in, say, transitional economies around the world as we are for ourselves. In fact, they have an opportunity in many ways to learn from the experience of developing a culture of charitable giving in Western economies and skip some of the mistakes we made. So I think there's a lot of room to kind of strive for that optimistic figure. To put $550 billion in perspective, we're talking about a figure which is slightly more than the GNP of Poland, for example, just less than the GNP of Sweden. So it's a hugely significant figure that puts the $175 billion a year estimated by Jeffrey Sachs to be needed to eradicate global poverty into some kind of perspective. So I think the potential, if we succeed in creating a culture of giving and putting the right policies in place to get middle class, ordinary people to give, could be significant. We also need to bear in mind that when we think about middle class people, about broader participation in charitable giving in society, that is as crucial as the resources in themselves. It's as crucial as the amount of money raised. A civil society without engagement of the masses is a civil society that doesn't have popular legitimacy. And we're seeing around the world in lots of kind of popular movements and signs of dissent that without that representation by civil society, there can be pretty damaging unintended consequences for governments of policies that don't encourage society. So we've heard from Debbie about some of the kind of macro level relationships between giving, particularly giving money, and what we're seeing in the global economy. We've heard that there has been in the past a relationship between the sort of global outlook in the economy and the proportion of people who give money to charity. Now that's, intuitively that makes sense to us, I think. But when we dig down into country level data, we see a very different story. We see that if we look at this chart which is showing the 5-year changes in the proportion of people who give money to charity in every country around the world, to the left of your screen, you're seeing bars that are negative. So they're countries that have experienced a sort of recession in the number of people who are giving money to charity. On the right-hand side, those bars that are headed towards the right are countries that have seen a positive growth over the last 5 years in the proportion of people who are giving money to charity. You can see that the data is hugely divergent, which it leads to the question of, why is the data so divergent? What is the relationship between economic growth, if there is one? So if we take a look at some of the countries that are seeing a decline, the first example that's worth a look, I think, is Venezuela, which has seen a 9 percentage point fall in the number of people, the proportion of people giving money to charity over the last 5 years. Now, there has been only a 2% growth over that last 5 years, and it's well known that it's kind of Venezuela's resource-reliant economy is prone to sort of economic turbulence. So maybe, that lack of optimism in the economy could be a reason behind giving. So it leads to the question, could economics alone be an explanation for such a dramatic fall? Well, not necessarily. If we look elsewhere in the region, in South America, we can see that there has been significant falls in the proportion of people giving money to charity over the same 5-year period in countries that have seen actually fairly healthy economic growth, particularly Ecuador with a 4.3% average annual growth in its economy, and yet a 7 percentage points drop in the proportion of people giving money to charity. So what else could it be? What have those countries got in common? Well, you might say, okay, well, maybe it's a regional thing. Perhaps that there's a kind of shared culture or regional dynamic to such a fall in giving. Well, the first thing that I would say is that doesn't seem to be true, because both Paraguay and Uruguay have seen huge growth in the proportion of people giving money to charity. But I think we can also say, from the examples that I picked here of Bulgaria, Sweden and Zambia, that there are no real shared sense of geography or level of income or culture. These, they are hugely diverse countries that are seeing very different trends in lots of different ways, that are all seeing drops in the proportion of people giving money to charity. Sweden is a very high income country, has seen a surprising drop in giving money to charity. And we can hypothesize that this may be that in Sweden, much of the giving that occurs is to international organisations, and there may have been some degree of kind of humanitarian malaise, that a lot of people have given a lot of money to humanitarian causes over the last few years, and they've experienced some fatigue about it. But that one example is not an example that has a kind of shared theme across. So we start to see that there are very different country-level specific reasons why we might see drops in the proportion of people giving to money to charity, and I'll come back to some of those reasons later on. Let's have a look at some of the countries that have seen growth. So South Africa and India are really interesting examples, I think, as both members of the BRICS, both transitioning economies. They've experienced very strong growth over the last 5 years. But I think one of the interesting things about both these countries is that we're also seeing, CAF has offices in both those countries, and we're also seeing very strongly the development of a strong culture of giving. And that is backed up by an environment, a legal environment, where if there are barriers to giving, those barriers have not necessarily been reached. So in South Africa, they have a very enabling post-apartheid constitution, which sets out the right to engage in civil society, and some legislation that incentivizes giving quite strongly. In India, the growth in giving has been fairly meteoric, and it has a point exactly to why that might be, something that we're certainly working towards, but we're seeing a kind of maintenance of a social norm that may be related to religion, but also I think there's a strong sense that with wealth comes responsibility. But the question is, how do you replicate that? What can be learned from those situations? One example to look at is the example of the USA, who, despite already being a country that's synonymous with a culture of philanthropy, is also a very high income country. So to have maintained such an impressive level of growth in the proportion of people giving money to charity, an 8% growth over the last 5 years, despite a relatively modest economic performance over those 5 years of an average of 2.6% growth, is really impressive. And I think the reason that has been able to happen in the US is conversations about philanthropy and the approaches by government and pressure on government to maintain the legal environment for giving is very strong, and that's meant that any barriers to giving have been addressed. So that's a really strong example to show that giving can continue even as the low-hanging fruit in policy terms is taken away. Sorry about that. I thought I'd just give you a sneak preview of what's to come now. Actually, I want to move back to that last one. So I've added there in the bottom right, Romania, just to illustrate that we don't have all the answers, I think. You see that Romania has been pretty much in recession over the last 5 years with an average of just a 0.3% growth in GDP. And yet it's seen a huge growth in the proportion of people giving money to charity. Now, you know, I might say that in Eastern Europe generally there's been a fairly strong growth. You see that in Slovenia and Slovakia, for example. That may be because these are countries where a couple of decades after independence and the end of communism, people are starting to develop that culture of giving. You might see that that's a locomotive force that you would expect in that kind of country. But then I also showed you the example of neighbouring Bulgaria, which is in the top right, which has seen stronger economic growth than its neighbour, and yet a 9 percentage point drop in the proportion of people giving this charity. I don't yet have an answer to that, but that's very much the kind of thing that we're looking to try and use to give us some learnings, particularly in terms of policy. Now, with a lot of these examples I've shown, there is one thing that I think is in common, and that's they're being influenced, both the growing ones and the declining ones, by policy, by the government's approach to charitable giving. So actually in Ecuador, there's been a couple of very negative pieces of government legislation over the last couple of years, which has made it very difficult for charities both to register, to receive funding, and to engage in advocacy and campaigning. And that's really hurt the sector, both in terms of organisations' ability to exist and receive money, and in terms of their ability to be independent, which of course donors really appreciate. It's a similar story in Venezuela, and in fact in Zambia, all with recent pieces of quite negative legislation which restrict charities' ability to both receive funds and to operate. On the other hand, as we discussed, we've seen the quite progressive legal environments in the US and in South Africa, though these are battles that we have to constantly give our attention to maintain. So, staying with that theme of government policy, what I put up here is a map which essentially represents some of the case studies and examples that are used in the Future World Giving reports. Now, the first report looks at what governments can do to build trust, public trust in charitable giving. The second looks at how governments can maintain the independence of civil society, and the way in which both those factors of trust and independence impact on donors' willingness to give money and to engage and participate in civil society. Now, I don't have time to talk you through those reports. What I do want to do, though, is just show you what some of those case studies and examples look like on a map. So the green countries are countries where broadly we've seen progressive legislation in the last couple of years. Now, in many of those cases, they're starting from quite a low base of charitable giving, i.e. they don't have a high proportion of people giving money to charity in those countries. But nevertheless, it's positive to see progressive legislation. The red countries are countries in which there have been recent restrictions to advocacy and campaigning, the freedom of civil society to be independent in its voice, essentially. So there's been a crackdown on campaigning that has not only existed in what we might think of kind of fairly repressive countries, but also in the developed world. So take, for example, in Canada, there's been quite a worrying trend for the Canada Revenue Agency to seemingly, allegedly, investigate environmental charities kind of disproportionately. In the UK, we've had the recent Lobbying Act, which affects charities' ability to be able to engage in campaigning activities in the run-up to an election. It requires them to kind of record their spending in a very kind of micro manner and have that kind of reported to the regulators. In other countries, though, we're seeing a much more flagrant use of legislation to restrict advocacy by charities. So in countries like Algeria and Azerbaijan, and to some extent Indonesia, we have actual legislation which changes the relationship between civil society and the state, where essentially it will be possible to prosecute organisations simply for criticising the government and its agenda. The blue countries are countries where we've seen foreign funding affected. So they're countries where the government has issued policy which will restrict the access of in some cases, all civil society organisations, in others, civil society organisations which engage in campaigning. And this is a huge trend that we're seeing that's spreading. It seems to be spreading incredibly fast around the world. Mina Kai, the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of association and assembly, described this restriction to foreign funding as one of the biggest concerns of his mandate. So it's something that I think is underappreciated and extremely worrying around the world. I think a lot of people know about the case in Russia of the foreign agents law, but it's by no means isolated to Russia. We're seeing it spread through a number of countries around the world, including fairly recently Ethiopia, Nigeria, as I said before, Venezuela. We've even seen some quite worrying signs in India, although the High Court did yesterday overturn a block on funding from foreign donors to Greenpeace India. So at least there is some positive news on that front. The countries that have been shown in yellow are countries that have vague new powers, essentially. Now, in a lot of ways, this is a more worrying development, which is legislation around civil society activities, which are very hard to understand how you would breach or how you would meet the regulation. Now, this has the effect, if you don't know exactly what regulation around campaigning activity means, you don't know whether you've breached it or not. And for a small organisation that might otherwise be risking huge fines or prison sentences, in fact, it seems the most logical thing to do is to not do any campaigning to make sure that you don't breach it. And some of this legislation, I think, needs to be addressed and challenged. For example, in Vietnam, it's possible for civil society organisations to be tried for defamation of the government. Now, it's very difficult to see how government cannot be defamed if you're criticising it. So these are things that I think need to be addressed. So another way in which we've used the questions raised by the World Giving Index is in a report that we recently produced with Nexus and with McDermott, Will and Emery, called The Rules to Give by Index. Now, this is the first global analysis of the legal environment of domestic giving that covers all 193 UN recognised nations. It produces a score from 1 to 11 for how enabling that environment is in terms of the kind of legal environment, specifically in terms of incentives and kind of tax status. It uses the World Giving Index as a kind of to sort of compare those findings and see whether there is an effect on giving based on that. So is there a relationship between the legal environment and the proportion of people giving money to charity? We produced this map which shows the scores from the World Giving Index, and you can see it actually looks fairly similar to that map. The countries that have the least enabling environments, they both correlate quite well with the World Giving Index in terms of the proportion of people giving, and they correlate quite well in terms of countries that have seen recent barriers erected in legislation. So this shows the kind of overall picture of the different questions that we asked in our rules to give by index. The obvious thing to take from this is that there's a high degree of consensus around the world that civil society organisations should be exempt from taxation, and there's also a high degree of agreement that civil society organisations should have some form of regulation, that they should at least be expected to report some of their finances. So that's the case in 80% of countries around the world. There's also a pretty high degree of consensus that corporations should receive tax incentives for charitable giving. 77% of countries have that. But interestingly, only 66% of countries have tax incentives for individuals. Now, I think that gap is a really interesting gap, and I wonder about what message that sends to the public in countries that have incentives for companies but not for individuals. So here we can see the sort of first cut of comparing World Giving Index data with Rules to Give by data. So where you can see there, DM, that's donating money, the proportion of people who donate money to charity. So if we look at all the countries that are tax exempt, that do have tax exemptions for charities, you see an average of 30% of people donating money to charity compared to just 23% where charities are not tax exempt. It's a similar story for countries in terms of whether they have reporting requirements for non-profits. In countries that do, it's about 30% people give, but it drops by 2 percentage points in those that don't. And similarly, again, in terms of whether reporting requirements for organisations are sensitive to size. Interestingly, those countries that do have a regulatory system that allows smaller organisations to have less bureaucratic regulation, see 44% of people giving money to charity compared to 26% where they don't. That may be that obviously there's a higher degree of development of the regulatory system, so it may just be accounted for in that countries are richer and more developed, but it's still an interesting finding, I think. Now, if we look at the percentage of people donating money and the availability of tax incentives, just the most simple way of putting this data, you can see a hugely significant relationship. It's impossible to show causation, obviously, but in terms of the relationship, in countries that offer tax incentives to individuals, 33% of individuals give money to charity compared to 21% of individuals in countries that have no incentives for individuals. Now, the obvious point that we might come to there is, well, countries that don't have tax incentives for individuals might be poorer countries and people might have less resources to give. And I think that's a valid question, which is why we also cut the data by World Bank income groups. And this is where I think it gets really interesting. Because we see across the board that tax incentives, the countries that have tax incentives see a higher rate of giving. Now, might that be because people give more money to charity and therefore have demanded tax incentives from their government? Maybe. It's difficult to show causation. But I think it's interesting and possibly instructive for governments, particularly in developing and transitioning economies, to see that actually regardless of income, incentives seem to work. And in fact, to some extent, it seems to be a stronger relationship in low-income countries than everywhere else. Now, maybe this is because, as we spoke about earlier, when you give people a message at the start of their relationship with wealth, that they can also use some of that wealth to have agency within civil society, that's a much stronger message. So we perhaps should be pushing more for tax incentives in developing countries, even if the amount of money raised in terms of resources isn't that significant. The message is important, I think, which is particularly sad, given that 47% of those countries that have no tax incentives for individuals are in Africa. So if that is a message we should be sending to governments, it's certainly not a message that's getting through at the moment. What all this brings us to is that governments, particularly in transitioning economies, need to think about tax incentives in terms of building a culture rather than in terms of the kind of the tax-based analysis of how efficient it is. The broader kind of long-term effect it has on civil society and democracy is significant. So tax incentives, they're kind of a lot of extra potentially happy consequences. So essentially, in terms of the World Giving Index, we've seen that we've been able to use it to bring in lots of other different ideas, and it can be quite a powerful data set. We encourage you to kind of use it yourselves. The data is there to be used, and we encourage you to run with it. And we're happy to work with you to use it in any way you want, or for you to join in with our campaigns. So if you want to do a little bit further reading, we encourage you to kind of take down some of these links to access both the kind of World Giving Index, Russia Giving and India Giving reports. Future World Giving website has all of the Future World Giving reports, as well as a regular blog which is maintained, updating you around trends in giving around the world, and the Rules to Give by Index, which is the one that we've just been talking about, which looks at kind of the efficacy of tax incentives around the world. So that's it from me. You think the thing to do now, I guess, is to thank you for engaging in this webinar, and let's have a look at some of the questions that you might pose.
Hello, Adam. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation to you and to Debbie. I'm going to start with a question that I have here from Martina. She's asking, how does the insight that clear rules to give influence giving? As perhaps it becomes more transparent, explain the case of Myanmar, or in other words, how could informal rules and potentially vicinity to the receivers, for example, monks in Myanmar, influence giving? Let's start with that question.
I lost a bit of reception there. I couldn't really hear the question. I heard that you were asking something about informal giving in Myanmar, but I missed the rest of it.
I'm going to send you the question by chat so you can have a look at it. I think it's going to be easier that way.
Okay.
1 second. Kath. Gary goes.
How does the insight that clear rules to give influence giving, as perhaps it becomes more transparent, explain the case of Myanmar? Or in other words, how could informal essentially vicinity?
Well, so I see the question. Myanmar, an example that everyone's fascinated by. Giving in Myanmar is so incredibly high, and yet the legal environment is not particularly progressive. But a lot of the giving in Myanmar, as was discussed, is given through Theravada Buddhist monasteries, essentially. In some ways, those monasteries can be considered as service providers locally. And so that opens up this much broader question about when do you define charity as charity and when do you not define it as charity. But if we take it as read that this is charitable giving, but at a very informal level, then we need to think about improving the legal environment to get the most benefit out of that giving. So we're seeing, for example, in in Kenya a real thriving of community foundations and of a building of structures above those community foundations to take informal giving and create some sense of kind of trust in formal civil society. But the best way to do that is to make it easy for civil society organisations to be recognised by the government and to be regulated effectively to help to build trust in those organisations. So I think it's about, whilst giving in Myanmar is clearly something that lots of people do, there's a question about whether that could be more effective if the legal environment was better, whether it could be used at a kind of higher level, whether that money could be, you know, pooled or used in more innovative ways than just in kind of very local level service provision. Laura, do we have any more questions?
Thank you for that. I have another question here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead. It says, you mentioned the small percentage of young people donating. There has been some discussion around the role of the next generation or new millennials in promoting the culture of giving. Can you talk a little bit about this role of this new or the next generation?
Well, I mean, I think there are some kind of we need to look at some factors. You know, around the world since the recession, there's been a bit of a crisis in youth unemployment, and I think if you factor out the higher levels of unemployment amongst young people, that might explain some of the difference. So I think there's potentially some explanation in youth unemployment levels. But at the same time, there is clearly a job to do to try and engage younger people in giving. Some countries do this very well, actually. If we look at transitioning economies, some of those economies actually buck this trend. So, you know, South Africa and India, for example, see, and even Russia actually, see the proportion of people between the age of 15 and 24 is about the same or even higher in the case of India, I think, than people that are over 50. Whereas in the rest of the world, there's about an 8 percentage point gap between the two age groups. So I think possibly we ought to look at those countries that are seeing higher rates of giving amongst young people and see if there's anything that we can learn from them.
Thank you. Regarding, because you mentioned the crisis, do you think the economic crisis has affected the enabling environment in some countries or the tax incentives either for individuals or organizations for donating?
It's hard to know exactly what motivations are in terms of tax incentives and the relationship between that and the recession that we experienced. A lot of countries are having to cut huge deficits, and there are definitely conversations taking place around tax incentives. In the UK, a couple of years ago, the government proposed putting a cap on tax incentives, and that was something that we were able to demonstrate, Charities Aid Foundation and our partners were able to demonstrate through a campaign that we ran called Give It Back, George, that would actually be detrimental, not just to charities, but to the country through the kind of the many services that charities efficiently provide. So I think where the sector is able to demonstrate the effectiveness of those tax incentives in terms of delivering services and in terms of kind of making a country a better represented and more kind of democratically healthy place to be, tax incentives should be relatively easy to defend, I think. But I'm sure that it is a conversation that's been had in many countries around the world. I know that in the US they're considering legislation that would put a cap on giving or even a floor on how much money you need to donate in order to receive tax incentives. So I can imagine that that's occurring around the world.
Yeah, exactly. That's an ongoing discussion right now in the U.S. that would be really interesting to keep following. I have one last question here from Kim Walters. Do you have any examples of how this index has been used by an organization to help increase participation in their employee fundraising and volunteering programs?
Well, as Debbie mentioned before, an entire organisation was set up with the help of the Malaysian government to encourage volunteering after being shocked by the low ranking for volunteering in a previous World Giving Index report. So it clearly has that potential effect. It can be quite hard to track the definite impact of the World Giving Index because people might be influenced by it, but might not necessarily record that in the way that they manage things externally. But you only need to spend some time on the web, Googling the World Giving Index, to see how often it's referenced in conversations within civil society and within government. And we're happy to track. We're happy to just put it out there and let people use it however they want. But certainly we'd be interested in knowing more about how people are using it. So if anyone that's part of this webinar is going to use it, we'd really like to know how you're using it, and we'd be interested in helping to promote your use of it as well.
I think it's also worth mentioning that in terms of employee schemes and looking at employee CSR and volunteering, that Charities Aid Foundation has conducted other research, which you can find on our publication site on our website, which looks at the penetration of employee volunteering and payroll giving schemes within the UK and within other markets. So there is other information available looking specifically at that area, which perhaps isn't covered by the World Giving Index in sort of granular detail.
Yeah, I think the World Giving Index exists to provide context. So it allows people engaging in advocacy to look where their country ranks in the World Giving Index and compare it to other countries, and that can be a very powerful tool. In some countries, the World Giving Index is the only data available on giving and volunteering and helping a stranger. But in a lot of countries, if you really want to get down to granular detail of what is or what isn't happening in that country, you'll need to engage in more detailed country-level research, and that's why we produce UK giving, Russia giving, India giving, and we're looking at producing other reports in other countries as well.
Thank you very, very much. This was a very interesting webinar, as data is becoming such an important driver for organizations working with philanthropy in shaping their work. Now we're going to be closing the poll. I want to thank Errol for helping with the connection of Wings and CAP to make this webinar happen. I would also would like to ask you to take a few seconds to answer the 3 questions that I'm going to open up right now. It only takes a few seconds. This is to see how useful the webinar was to you, if you would attend more webinars, and how was the quality of the webinar regarding the audio and the call. And this is going to help us improve our webinars in the future. Thank you very much to everyone, to all the participants and our members that joined the webinar. I hope to see you for a new one in February 11th. That we're going to have one with the Foundation Center regarding a new visualizing tool. And I think that's it. Thank you, Adam and Deborah, for such an interesting presentation. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.